Most Honorable and Your Holiness, Prime Minister. You may be seated. The Most Honorable and Your Holiness, Prime Minister, Dr. Uma Ramakrishnan, IMF Mission Chief, Dr. the Honorable Nigel Clark, Minister of Finance, and other members of the Cabinet, Permanent Secretaries, Resident Representative of the IMF, Dr. Constant, Governor of the Bank of Jamaica, Mr. Brian Winter, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, members of the media, good morning. Welcome to the IMF closing meeting and press conference. At this time, I'd like to invite Dr. Ramakrishnan to make her presentation.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. The IMF team reached a preliminary agreement with the Jamaican authorities on a set of policies to complete the fourth review under the standby arrangement. Considerations by the IMF's executive board is tentatively scheduled for November 2018. Upon approval, an additional US dollars 226 million will be made available for Jamaica, bringing the total accessible credit to about US dollars 1.2 billion. The Jamaican authorities continue to treat the arrangement as precautionary. Program implementation remains robust. All quantitative performance criteria for end June 2018 were met, and structural reforms are on track. The primary surplus of the central government operations exceeded the program target by 0.7% of GDP, driven mainly by continued buoyant taxes. Capital expenditure, which has typically lagged in Jamaica, has exceeded budget by 13%, and non-borrowed reserves overperformed by about 400 million. Economic growth is projected to reach about 1.4% in the current fiscal year, supported by mining and construction, and is expected to increase further to about 2% in the medium term. Sustainably reducing the private sector wage bill is important to channel savings towards social and growth-enhancing spending. It is important to advance this difficult but critical reform. Leveraging the current window from the 4-year wage agreement will help prioritize government functions and institute a new compensation framework for public sector employees. It is important for the Bank of Jamaica to continue improving monetary policy signaling and limiting FX interventions to episodes of disorderly foreign exchange market conditions. Meanwhile, the government is moving to table legislation that amends the Bank of Jamaica Act to anchor monetary policy on price stability. Ongoing improvements in monetary policy toolkit are clear, and clear communication are essential for the success of this flagship reform. The strong economic fundamentals in Jamaica and sustained policy implementation of the authorities' reform program provide the private sector with an unprecedented opportunity to expand domestic investment, generate economic opportunities, and become the growth engine for Jamaica. Jamaica will also benefit from fostering financial inclusion policies while taking into consideration financial stability risks. Addressing domestic constraints to financial intermediation will support market deepening and further catalyze domestic investment. In that regard, the recommendations of the recent IMF's Financial Sector Assessment Program provide certain frameworks for this to move forward. With that, I shall close, and I thank greatly the authorities and all the stakeholders with whom we have had very productive consultations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ramakrishnan. Dr. the Honorable Nigel Clark, Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Kimberly. A team from the IMF, led by Mission Chief Uma Ramakrishnan, began the fourth review under the standby arrangement on the 10th of September, and it concludes today on the 21st. As is customary, the IMF team met with government officials and technical staff, private sector leaders, leaders from the union movement, and other stakeholders. The shared assessment of the IMF and of the government of Jamaica is that Jamaica's policy implementation remains, under the economic reform program, remains strong. Jamaica has met all quantitative performance criteria under the program through to the end of June 2018, and the government has also met all 21 structural benchmarks in the program to date, of which 7 have been on the macro-fiscal side and 14 have been connected with public sector reform. It may be noted that there are only 2 structural benchmarks remaining under the standby arrangement as at the commencement of the 4th review. The first of these is the tabling of the Bank of Jamaica Act in Parliament by October of 2018, which the government is on track to meet. And the second is ensuring that the cap on the stock of domestic arrears remains capped at 6.4 billion, which is measured on a monthly basis and which the government continues to meet. You will recall that when the budget was tabled in Parliament for this financial year, 2018-19, it included a significant increase in capital expenditure by central government, and it generates a primary surplus of 7% of GDP with no new revenue measures. I'm pleased to announce, as I've said publicly before, that budget execution remains strong. The government's primary surplus exceeded the budget as at the end of June 2018 by an appreciable degree, and tax revenues were buoyant. Capital expenditure has been overperforming, and as Uma Ramakrishnan said, as at the end of June, capital expenditure was 13% ahead of budget, with the significant ongoing infrastructure spending. The supplementary budget, which is to be tabled in Parliament shortly, will also ensure that the primary surplus target of 7% of GDP is met. The government remains fully committed to the reform agenda and is escalating efforts aimed at increasing domestic investment and growth, boosting job creation, and bolstering economic resilience while maintaining a prudent fiscal posture. Public sector reform remains a key focus of policy implementation, with emphasis placed on accelerating the rationalization of public bodies and reintegration into parent ministries, advancing the development of a new public sector compensation framework, as well as phased implementation of the integrated human resources and payroll system. In support of Bank of Jamaica's transition towards full-fledged inflation targeting, the government is far advanced in the preparation of the amendments to the GOJ Act for tabling in Parliament by the end of October of 2018. These amendments will clarify the mandate of the bank to be focused on price stability. It will enhance the autonomy of the central bank, improve its governance and accountability framework. Additional near-term actions include the development of a comprehensive disaster risk policy for Jamaica, as well as initiatives to further enhance financial sector resilience and the development of the foreign exchange market. Jamaica's key macroeconomic indicators continue to reflect positive and stable trends, as reflected in the performance of an outlook for domestic inflation, Jamaica's external accounts, Jamaica's official reserves, and market interest rates. Domestic inflation is currently lower than targeted, but is projected to return to the 4 to 6% medium-term target in the March 2019 quarter. Market interest rates are low. Real GDP growth, while modest, has been accelerating, and domestic unemployment continues to fall. Our focus remains to increase growth and resilience and raise the living standards for all Jamaicans while maintaining our public debt on a firm downward trajectory. We are pleased that the IIMF Executive Board is scheduled to consider the 4th review under the precautionary standby arrangement in November of 2018, and upon board approval, the amounts available for drawdown by Jamaica in the event that we need it would accelerate to approximately the equivalent of $1.2 billion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clark. The Most Honorable Andrew Holness, Prime Minister.
The government of Jamaica is pleased that our economic program is generally proceeding on track. Reform efforts are bearing fruits. The evidence of this, some of which have just been pointed out by Uma and Nigel. There is projected growth by the PIOJ. We have reserves which are ahead of program targets. I believe we now stand at about 3.1 billion US dollars. Employment continues to be strong. Inflation continues to be low. Interest rates are at record low. And generally, there is a sense of confidence in the economy. This means that there are opportunities in the economy. And these opportunities are expanding and increasing for the average person. The success of the economic program is not just impactful on the national economy, but it is impacting your household economy. More people are being employed. You're seeing the investments being made in infrastructure. Very shortly, connectivity via road will be much improved in Jamaica, and we hope that this will have an effect on productivity. Crime is down. And the government is sharing the dividends of the improved economy with the most vulnerable in our society. We have increased our social spending on PATH and on the HOPE program. So this is why we must continue with the reform program. We are now moving into the next phase of the reform program, which is the monetary policy reforms. That means we will be targeting inflation to ensure it's low, it's stable, but more importantly, it's predictable, so that businesses and households alike can plan for the future with certainty. They can assess their risks better and make better financial and investment decisions. Jamaica has undertaken a series of reforms in the last 10 years. We've done, with our IIMF partners, fiscal reforms. We have done public sector reform. We're doing monetary reform. But critical to all these reforms is governance. Governance is the critical element. Because in doing the reforms, we have created institutions. Institutions to embed the reforms and institutions to actuate the reforms. So then the central question becomes, how well are our institutions run? Who is running them? And are the people running them competent and capable? So it's not just how well they are run, but from a macro perspective, the institutions, if not run properly, or if run properly, can make either a profit or a loss, or they can grow or stagnate. If they make a loss, who bears it if they're a public institution? It is the public that bears it. And that leads to higher debt. If the institutions don't make good decisions that grow their portfolios, then the economy won't grow. So governance has a macro-critical nature to it. And so in the next half-yearly review, the government of Jamaica and the IMF will be looking at the key parameter of governance of our institutions. It means we'll be looking at public bodies. We will be looking at how our boards are appointed, the competence profile of the boards. We'll be looking at all the issues to give the public confidence that our public institutions are run in their best interest. We understand that governance impacts growth. It impacts your ability to get a job, to have better roads, and to have a better social safety net. And therefore, as we come to the ending of the IMF program with the IMF and Jamaica, one of the things that we want to institutionalize is good governance, to make sure that the sacrifice that the country has made in this decade of reform, that these reforms continue, that they are embedded, that they are not at the whims and fancies of the political cycle, and that the dividends are protected and preserved for generations to come. So governance will be part of our review come the next semi-annual review. And that's a very important message that the entire government should pay attention to. The other thing that came out of this review, and which was pointed out to me by the IMF team, is that clearly Jamaica is on the right path. We're not saying everything is perfect. There are challenges. But we are seeing emerging an enabling business environment with interest rates at record low levels. It begs the question, why isn't there more economic activity, more risk-taking, more investments from the private sector? This is not a blaming of the private sector. This is more an encouragement to the private sector that now is the time to get on board. Now is the time to make the investments. Clearly, there are many rigidities in the economy, and we cannot ignore the psychology of investment in Jamaica, the culture and the history that has created a business class, an entrepreneurial class, that for decades responded to the incentives that government policy gave, and the incentive was to invest in government debt. That has changed, and we want to ensure that our partners in the private sector understand that the signals that we are sending are quite different from what was sent a decade ago, and it requires now a different response. So I want to use this platform to appeal to the private sector. Now is the time to take advantage. Interest rates are low. We are targeting inflation. We are ensuring that the fiscal governance of public finance is such that you have certainty. Government is your best partner. Now is the time to invest.
Thank you, Prime Minister. At this time, we will invite questions from the media. We ask that you identify yourselves and the media entity you represent. Thank you.
Neville Graham, Gleaner Business, or the Financial Gleaner. Dr. Clark, you spoke earlier about some reforms to how public sector boards are constituted and so on. And in light of the Prime Minister's stated objective of making governance a critical part of the way forward, where are we with those reforms, and how soon can we see some further clarity on it?
Thank you for your question. I believe you're referring to the policy, the government's policy on the nomination, selection, and appointment of persons to public body boards. That policy was approved by the Cabinet earlier this year, and drafted instructions are being prepared for the Chief Parliamentary Council. And once those drafted instructions are received, the regulations that will give effect to that policy will be crafted and be laid in the House of Parliament for affirmative resolution. As you've heard, the Prime Minister, the government is committed to the implementation of this reform because of the relationship between good governance and positive macroeconomic outcomes.
Good morning, Kalila Reynolds, Nationwide News Network. This question is for the Prime Minister. You stressed the governance point quite a bit. And towards the end of that point, you said it's a very important message that the entire government should pay attention to. That sounded like a warning. Was it a warning? And what will you be doing, or the government will be doing, to ensure that these governance standards are adhered to?
Well, if it was interpreted as a warning, I wouldn't object. You would have heard the Minister of Finance explain the policy measures that have been taken, which will, some of them will find their way into legislation and regulations. But the government also has a duty itself to intensify the scrutiny of persons that it selects for boards. And I think that that is the high-level message that has to be sent out. The government itself has to now, even without regulation, even without policy, just internally ensure that we identify the skills and competencies necessary to ensure that our institutions operate in a way that are aligned with our stated targets of economic growth and prosperity.
Pleasant morning. Andrew Laidley, Television, Jamaica. My question is for Dr. Ramakrishnan. Having done your meetings over the past week, and with Jamaica almost at the end now of our relationship with you and with the fund, I want your professional opinion on whether you believe the country is in a position to carry on that torch after the IMF.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. Beyond doubt, we have been in this engagement with Jamaica since 2013 through two successive programs, the first one being the Extended Fund Facility, and now the standby arrangement, which is precautionary. And through these years of engagement, we have been working with the government. First of all, it should be very clear that this has been always the government's reform program, and the ownership is with the government and with the people of Jamaica. So this is what the success of this reform and the place where Jamaica is now in terms of its macro stability is because of what has been owned and completed by the government and the people. So that is because you want it. And so I don't see any reason to think that that is somehow going to change just because the IMF is not there. The show goes on, as I said, with or without the IMF. This is a trajectory that Jamaica has embraced and is going to follow. And what the minister and the prime minister are committed to is building the necessary institutions to make sure that the institutional framework that is necessary to create and move forward on these reforms is continued. On the fiscal side, a lot has already been done in terms of institutional reform, which include the fiscal responsibility law. There has been a lot of legislations that have been passed to enshrine and entrench fiscal responsibility in the governance framework. And on the monetary policy side, for example, now the next thing that's being done is entrenching the institutional framework for the Bank of Jamaica for monetary policy, so that price stability is entrenched in the law for the country. So these are the types of institutional reforms that will sustain for the duration, for a long time, the reform process, and that's what we are engaging with for the remainder of our lending arrangement. And what I would also emphasize is the IMF's engagement with Jamaica doesn't end. It lends in one frame, which is the lending frame, but we continue to engage with all our members, providing capacity development, technical assistance, and policy advice through a different framework called the Article 4. Thank you.
Prime Minister, the IMF is on record as saying that the contribution of EPOC to the success of the program, previous programs, is significant. There have been calls for the formation, institutionalization of a type of EPOC arrangement where the private sector would be consulted, or private sector stakeholders will be consulted more readily about economic direction, policy, and so on. What's the government's position on that, and how soon can we see something like that?
I'll allow the Minister of Finance, who has charge of that area, to answer.
Thank you, Neville. There is no doubt that, as Uma mentioned, the success of Jamaica's reform efforts, both in the standby arrangement and the EFF that preceded it, have been built on a foundation of domestic ownership. And we plan going forward to ensure that domestic ownership is something that continues. So the principles that provide the foundation for the success we've experienced, we intend to keep those principles alive, even if the manifestation is slightly different. So the government has spoken about a fiscal council and the intention of bringing legislation to Parliament that would establish a fiscal council. The idea behind a fiscal council is that it would strengthen our fiscal responsibility framework by providing an institution that can be the guardian and the interpreter of our fiscal rules. So the principles of domestic ownership, of transparency in fiscal accounts will continue into the medium and long term with this kind of institutional strengthening.
Thank you, Dr. Clark. Thank you, Prime Minister. Thank you, Dr. Ramakrishnan, members of the head table. With that, we've come to the end of the IMF closing meeting and press conference. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
You'll always remember that day you became a parent. That day, you made yourself a promise.